Ethan sat in the silence of his study, a room that had once been his sanctuary, but now felt like a mausoleum for a life that was about to be buried. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations, and the sharp, metallic scent of finality. In his hands, he held a simple, worn leather portfolio. Its edges were soft from years of use, the surface scarred with the faint lines of countless projects, dreams sketched on napkins, and contracts signed with hopeful hands. To anyone else, it was an object of little value. To Ethan, it was a repository of truth, a shield, and a sword, all bound in unassuming cowhide. An hour ago, he had told his wife Amelia that he had lost everything. He had chosen his words with the precision of an architect designing a load-bearing wall. He told her that his firm, a boutique agency he had poured his soul into for over a decade, had succumbed to the pressures of a volatile market. He said the contracts had dried up, the final client had pulled out, and the debts had finally swallowed them whole. He watched her face as he delivered the news, searching for a flicker of the woman he had married, a spark of partnership, of shared struggle. He found none. Amelia's beautiful face, a sculpture he had once considered a masterpiece of warmth and expression, had hardened into something cold and perfect, like polished marble. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, became chips of ice. There was no, "We'll get through this." There was no comforting hand on his arm. There was only a terrifying, assessing quiet. "I see," she had said, the two words falling into the room like stones into a deep well. She stood, smoothing the front of her silk blouse, an unconscious gesture of distancing herself from the mess he had just unveiled. "I need to think. I need to consider my options." Options. The word echoed in the space she had vacated. It wasn't our options. It was her options. She had walked out of the study without a backward glance, leaving him with the ghost of their shared future. He had remained seated, listening to her footsteps retreat down the hall. He heard the soft click of the guest room door, a space that had become her fortress over the past year. Then a more telling sound, the muffled cadence of her voice. He didn't have to strain to hear. The old house, a wedding gift from her parents, had thin walls. He caught phrases, snippets of a conversation that confirmed his deepest, most painful suspicions. "Dad, it's happened. Worse than we thought." "No, completely gone. I can't live like this. It's a matter of dignity. I'm calling Marcus Thorne in the morning." Marcus Thorne. The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Thorne wasn't just any lawyer. He was a shark, the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city, a man known for dismantling spouses with surgical precision. Her first call wasn't to a friend for comfort or to her mother for a shoulder to cry on. It was to her father, to strategize. Her first action was to arm herself for war. Ethan looked down at the portfolio in his lap. He ran a thumb over a deep scratch near the clasp, a mark left when he had dropped it in his haste on the day everything changed. Amelia thought he had lost his job. She thought his modest, artist-led firm had failed. She thought he was destitute, a failure, a weight that would drag her down from the glittering social stratosphere she and her family occupied. She was confident in her assessment, certain of his weakness. What she didn't know was that Ethan hadn't lost his job. He hadn't lost his firm. He had sold it. 3 months ago, his boutique agency had been acquired by a global architectural conglomerate in a deal that had taken 2 years of secret, painstaking negotiation. The number in the final agreement was not one of debt, but of breathtaking profit. It was a life-altering, dynasty-building sum. The worn leather portfolio in his hands didn't hold bankruptcy filings. It held the signed, executed, and funded acquisition contract. It held the blueprints for a new life, a new company, and a future she had just forfeited. Within an hour of his feigned confession, she had shown him her heart. And within a month, she would understand the catastrophic miscalculations she had just made. The foundation of her world, which she believed was built on her father's wealth and status, was about to be revealed as a structure he, the humble architect, had secretly owned all along. Hey everyone, and welcome. I see a lot of you filing in. Thank you for being here for another story. Before we dive into what happens next with Ethan and Amelia, I'd love to know where you're all watching from tonight. Drop your city or country in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you're enjoying the setup and want to see how this unfolds, do me a favor and tap that like button. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion. All right, let's get back to it. The battle lines have been drawn, but only one side knows it's a war. The days that followed Ethan's announcement were a masterclass in quiet cruelty. The official beginning of his public disgrace was staged, as most important family events were, around the imposing mahogany dining table of his in-laws, Richard and Eleanor. The summons had come via a clipped text from Amelia. Dinner at my parents' on Friday. They know. Walking into that house felt like presenting himself for judgment. The air was different now. The polite, if slightly condescending tolerance they had always shown him had evaporated, replaced by an atmosphere of undisguised pity and contempt. Richard, Amelia's father, was a man who wore his wealth like armor. A successful investment banker, he viewed the world as a simple equation of assets and liabilities, and it was clear which column he had now placed Ethan in. He greeted Ethan not with a handshake, but with a heavy, paternalistic pat on the shoulder that was less a gesture of comfort and more a physical assertion of dominance. Ethan, a tough break, I hear. A tough, tough break. But the market is a cruel mistress. No room for sentiment. His eyes, small and shrewd, scanned Ethan from head to toe, as if appraising a piece of furniture he was about to discard. Eleanor, a woman whose entire existence seemed dedicated to the maintenance of flawless appearances, fluttered around him with a pained expression. "Oh, Ethan, darling," she cooed, her voice laced with a theatrical sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We were so shocked to hear, simply devastated for you. And for Amelia, of course. It's so much for a young woman to bear." The implication was clear. His failure was a burden on her daughter. Amelia was a ghost at her own family's table. She sat beside him, a chasm of empty space between their chairs, her focus entirely on her wineglass, which she swirled with a restless, irritated energy. She hadn't spoken more than a dozen transactional words to him all week. Now, surrounded by her parents, she had fully retreated, becoming a silent, beautiful effigy of disappointment. Her silence was her verdict. The dinner was an agonizing, slow-motion dissection of his perceived failures. Richard held court, pontificating between bites of roasted duck. "The problem with these artistic ventures," he began, gesturing with his fork, "is a lack of pragmatism. You architects, you want to build monuments to your own ego. Beautiful, perhaps, but not profitable. You have to be hungry. You have to be a killer." Ethan met his gaze across the table, his expression placid. Inside, he felt a cold, clarifying anger coiling in his gut. He thought of the late nights, the weekends sacrificed, the sheer force of will it had taken to build his firm from a single desk in a rented room into an award-winning powerhouse sought after by the largest players in the industry. He had been a killer. He'd just hidden the blood. "Perhaps you should have come to me sooner, son," Richard continued, the word son dripping with condescension. "I could have looked at your books. I have a fellow, runs a large commercial development firm. I could probably get you an interview. A junior design position, maybe. Something to get you back on your feet. You'd have to swallow your pride, of course." A junior design position. It was a calculated insult, designed to strip him of the last vestiges of his professional identity. He would be a charity case, a project for Richard to manage, further proof of his own benevolent power. Eleanor chimed in, her concerns more aesthetic. "The most important thing is to manage the narrative, Richard. We can't have people thinking, well, you know, we'll just say Ethan is taking a sabbatical, reevaluating his career path. It sounds so much more intentional than failure. She looked at Ethan as if expecting his gratitude for this carefully crafted lie. Through it all, Ethan remained a study in calm. He ate his dinner methodically. He answered their backhanded questions with simple, direct statements that offered them no emotional purchase. He was a stone wall against which their waves of contempt crashed and receded. While they saw a broken man, defeated and adrift, Ethan was conducting a final, crucial survey. He was measuring the depth of their disdain, the arrogance of their assumptions. Each insult, each condescending piece of advice was another data point, another line item in a ledger he was compiling in his mind. At one point, under the pretense of reaching for his napkin, his hand brushed against the portfolio he had placed on the floor beside his chair. The familiar texture of the leather was a secret anchor in the storm. It was a tangible reminder of the reality they couldn't see. They were all sitting in a beautifully constructed stage set, playing their parts with gusto, utterly unaware that the set was about to be struck and the theater sold. He was not the tragic figure in their play. He was the producer, the director, and the owner of the production, and he was simply waiting for the final act. Amelia finally spoke, her voice cutting through her father's monologue. "Dad is right, Ethan. You need to be realistic. We need to be realistic." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and her eyes were cold with practicality. "The house will have to be the first thing to go. We can't afford the mortgage now." There it was. Not how will we manage, but the house will have to go. The home they had chosen together, the place where they had hosted friends and holidays, was reduced to a line on a balance sheet. He simply nodded, a gesture they interpreted as meek agreement. It was, in fact, an acknowledgement. He had received her message. The humiliation was now complete. The foundation for what came next was now firmly in place. The days bled into a week, each one a new layer of psychological frost in the once warm home. Amelia's move into the guest room was no longer a temporary retreat, but a permanent relocation. The door remained closed, a silent declaration of secession from their union. When they did cross paths in the hallway or kitchen, she treated him with a chillingly polite detachment, as if he were a distant relative who had overstayed his welcome. Her campaign, orchestrated with the tactical guidance of her father, began in earnest. It was no longer about offering pitying advice. It was about issuing directives. She left a glossy brochure for a high-rise condominium on the kitchen counter, a place she had once derided as a soulless box. A sticky note attached read, "More manageable." For her, not for them. One evening she approached him with a clipboard and pen, her face set with the grim determination of an auditor. "Ethan, we need to talk about the house," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "My father had his realtor do a preliminary valuation. If we list it now, we can get ahead of any financial distress becoming public knowledge." She avoided his eyes, her gaze fixed on the papers in her hand. "It's the only logical thing to do. We need to free up capital." Ethan looked at her, at the woman who had once traced the blueprints of this very house with him, her eyes shining with excitement as she imagined their life within its walls. Now, she was dismantling it with the same dispassionate efficiency. "And where would we go?" he asked, his voice quiet, testing her. "Well, I've been looking at some apartments," she said, finally flicking her gaze to his. "Something small for now, for you. I would probably stay with my parents for a little while, just until things are settled." The chasm between them widened into a canyon. She was already planning her exit, mapping out her escape route while drawing up the plans for his new, diminished life. The ultimate humiliation came a few days later. She presented it as an act of charity, a lifeline thrown from her world to his. "My father spoke to Jim Crawford," she announced, referring to the head of a massive, soulless commercial firm that churned out shopping malls and parking garages. The very antithesis of everything Ethan stood for architecturally. "He said he has a spot for you, in the drafting department. It's not glamorous, but it's a steady paycheck. You'd be working under one of their senior project managers. She said it with an air of finality, as if she had solved the irritating problem of his unemployment. To be a junior draftsman in Jim Crawford's concrete factory, to take orders from a project manager who likely got his degree online. It was a position for someone fresh out of school, not an award-winning architect who had been featured in global design magazines. The offer was a cage, padded with the promise of stability, designed to neuter him completely. "I'll think about it," Ethan said, his voice betraying nothing. The calm on his face was a mask so perfectly rendered that it infuriated her. She wanted him to break, to rage, to beg. His dignity was an affront to the narrative she was constructing. "There's nothing to think about, Ethan," she snapped, her composure finally cracking. "You're in no position to be proud. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? For my family?" While this slow-motion demolition of his life played out at home, Ethan's real life was taking shape elsewhere. Each morning, after Amelia left for her errands, which he knew included meetings with her lawyer, he would drive not to a depressing temp agency, but to a gleaming, minimalist office space in a newly constructed tower downtown. The lease was in the name of a holding company so discreet it was practically invisible. There he would meet David, his business partner and friend, the only other person who knew the whole truth. David, a brilliant pragmatist who had handled the business end of their firm, had watched Ethan's plan unfold with a mixture of awe and concern. "Are you sure about this, man?" David asked one morning, gesturing around the expansive, sun-drenched space. The office was a blank canvas of polished concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. "This is some next-level Bond villain stuff." Ethan smiled, the first genuine smile in weeks. "It's not about revenge, David. It's about clarity." He walked over to a large table where a series of architectural models were laid out. They weren't designs for corporate headquarters or luxury condos. They were innovative, sustainable designs for community centers, homeless shelters, and public libraries. "This is the Phoenix Foundation," Ethan explained, his voice filled with a passion Amelia hadn't heard in years. "We're not going to build for the 1% anymore. We're going to use the profits from the sale to build for everyone else." The sale. The numbers were so large they still seemed unreal. The acquisition had not only made Ethan and David incredibly wealthy, but it had also given them the ultimate freedom, the freedom to work without compromise. While Amelia and her father were plotting how to get him a charity job drafting big box stores, Ethan was finalizing the endowment for a foundation that would reshape communities. He would spend his days in this secret world of quiet, focused creation, mapping out a future built on purpose. Then he would drive home to his cold, silent house, put on his mask of defeat, and endure another evening of Amelia's withering pity and her family's condescending advice. The contrast was dizzying. It was like living in two separate realities. In one, he was a failure, a charity case. In the other, he was a king, surveying a kingdom of his own making. He knew this duality couldn't last. The two worlds were on a collision course, and the impact was only a week away. The final week before the scheduled meeting felt like the strange, oppressive calm that precedes a hurricane. The air in the house grew heavy, still, and thick with unspoken finalities. The polite fictions had been stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard framework of an ending. Amelia no longer bothered with pretenses. She moved through the house with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of a liquidator, her presence a constant, painful reminder of what he was losing, or rather, what he had already lost. She had begun to pack in earnest. Not everything, just the items she deemed unequivocally hers. Expensive clothes, jewelry, art she had selected, books her father had given her. One afternoon, Ethan came home to find her in their master bedroom, a room he hadn't slept in for weeks, with several large moving boxes. She was taking a painting off the wall, a beautiful abstract landscape they had bought together on their honeymoon in Italy. He stood in the doorway, watching her. She carefully wrapped the painting in bubble wrap, her movements precise and unhesitating. She didn't acknowledge his presence until the piece was safely leaning against a box. "I'm just getting a few of my things organized," she said, her tone defensive, as if he had no right to question her. "It will make things easier when the time comes." "That was our painting, Amelia," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She stopped, her back to him. "My father paid for it," she replied without turning around. "It was a wedding gift. To me." The distinction was a scalpel, expertly wielded, severing another of the fine threads that had once bound them together. Everything was being recontextualized through the lens of ownership and monetary value. What had been theirs was now being audited and assigned to its rightful owner. In her accounting, he owned very little. Later that day, she left a neatly printed list on the kitchen island. It was a list of 3 real estate agents, all from the city's most aggressive, high-end firms. Beside each name, she had written a note: "Specializes in quick sales. Best network for discreet buyers. Recommended by Dad." He picked up the list, the paper cool and smooth in his hand. It felt like a final eviction notice. Ethan spent that evening alone. Amelia was out, having dinner with friends she was no doubt recruiting to her side of the narrative. The silence of the large house was profound. It seemed to amplify his thoughts, his memories. He walked from room to room, a ghost in his own life, touching the furniture, running his hand along the doorframes. He wasn't mourning the house itself. A house was just a structure, a collection of materials. He was a master of structures. He could build another. He was mourning the dream that was supposed to fill it. He found himself in his study, the room where the charade had begun. On his desk was a framed photo of him and Amelia, taken on their wedding day. They were laughing, caught in a moment of unguarded joy, their heads close together, the future an unwritten, sunlit page before them. He looked at the smiling woman in the photograph and felt a deep, wrenching sadness. He had loved that woman. He wondered if she had ever truly existed, or if she had been a projection of his own hopes. He had to know, for himself, if there was anything left to salvage. He opened his laptop and began to type, not a letter of anger or recrimination, but one of quiet sorrow. He wrote about their beginning, about the dreams they had shared, about the man he had tried to be for her. He acknowledged his own faults, his periods of obsessive work, his quiet nature that she often mistook for aloofness. But he also laid out, gently, his perspective on their life together, a partnership he had cherished and believed in. He ended it with a simple, vulnerable question. Is there any part of that partnership you still believe is worth fighting for? He printed the letter, folded it, and slid it under her door at the guest room. It was his final test. Not a test of her loyalty to his failed self, but a test of her memory, of her heart. He knew her response, or lack thereof, would be the final piece of information he needed before the meeting. The next morning, he found the letter on the kitchen counter, placed neatly next to the car keys. It was unopened. She hadn't even read it. That was the moment the sadness calcified into resolve. The grief for the man and woman in the wedding photo was real, but it was grief for something that was already gone, like mourning a death that had happened long ago. His quiet sorrow had been a necessary step, a final look back before he turned and faced what was ahead. Now, there was no more looking back. He picked up the unopened letter and walked back to his study. He sat at his desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. He began to make a different kind of list, not of assets or real estate agents, but of grievances. He wrote down every condescending remark from Richard, every pained sigh from Eleanor, every cold, dismissive glance from Amelia. He listed the charity job offer, the demand to sell their home, the calculated division of their shared life. He wrote with a calm, methodical clarity, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the quiet house. This was not a document of anger. It was a blueprint for a deconstruction. As an architect, he knew that before you could build something new, You often had to demolish what was already standing, especially if the foundation was rotten. He placed the list inside his worn leather portfolio alongside the acquisition agreement. The quiet before the storm was over. The first winds of change were beginning to stir. The day of the meeting arrived, cloaked in a gray, drizzling sky that seemed to mirror the mood. The chosen venue was, predictably, the Lion's Den, Richard and Eleanor's grand, neo-Georgian mansion. The house was Richard's primary testament to his own success, a monument of limestone and mahogany designed to intimidate and impress. As Ethan pulled into the long, circular driveway, he felt the familiar pressure of the place, the unspoken demand for deference. Today, however, he would not be deferring. He was met at the door not by a housekeeper, but by Richard himself, a clear power play. Richard was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his at-home attire, looking every bit the master of his domain. "Ethan, come in," he said, his voice booming with a false heartiness that didn't reach his eyes. "Glad you could make it. Let's get this unpleasantness over with, shall we?" He led Ethan not to the comfortable living room, but to the formal dining room, the same room where his humiliation had been served up a few weeks prior. The scene was set for an execution. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cold light of the chandelier above. Seated at the table were Eleanor, looking pale and anxious, Amelia, a statue of cold beauty at her mother's side, and a man Ethan didn't know, but immediately recognized from his reputation. He was sharp-featured, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a suit that was even more expensive than Richard's. This was Marcus Thorne, the divorce lawyer. The shark was in the water. "Ethan, this is Marcus Thorne," Richard said, gesturing to the lawyer. "Marcus is a family friend. He's here to help us navigate this transition smoothly and amicably." Thorne stood and offered a firm, dry handshake. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice a low, confident baritone. "My goal here is to ensure a fair and equitable resolution for all parties." Ethan knew that fair and equitable was a euphemism for whatever his clients wanted. Ethan took his designated seat. It was at the far end of the table, opposite Richard, who sat at the head like a king holding court. Amelia and Eleanor were to Richard's right, a united front. Thorne sat to his left, his briefcase open on the table, a stack of documents neatly arranged beside it. Ethan was deliberately isolated, positioned as the supplicant. He placed his own worn leather portfolio on the table in front of him, a stark, humble contrast to Thorne's gleaming Italian leather briefcase. The gesture was ignored. Richard cleared his throat, signaling the official start of the proceedings. "All right," he began, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Let's be frank, Ethan. This situation is a tragedy, but it is what it is. Your business has failed. Your income is gone. The lifestyle that Amelia is accustomed to, the lifestyle that, frankly, you have been fortunate enough to enjoy, is no longer sustainable." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Amelia stared at the table, her jaw tight. "Amelia has been through enough," Richard continued, his voice taking on a tone of righteous indignation. "She stood by you while you pursued your little artistic dream, but there comes a point where a man must face reality. You have failed to provide for my daughter. The marriage, for all intents and purposes, is over." Ethan remained silent, his face a mask of calm attention. He let Richard speak, giving him all the rope he needed. "Now," Richard said, sliding a document across the table, "Marcus has drawn up a preliminary separation agreement. We've tried to be generous, considering the circumstances." Ethan didn't look at the document. He kept his eyes on Richard. "It's quite simple," Richard went on, clearly enjoying his position of power. "We will assume the remaining mortgage on your house and handle its sale. This will protect your credit, which you'll need. Amelia will, of course, retain her personal belongings and assets. In exchange for your full cooperation, for making this quick and clean, I am prepared to offer you a settlement, a one-time payment of $50,000. to help you get back on your feet. $50,000. A pittance. It was an amount calculated to be just enough to seem generous to an outsider, but small enough to be a profound insult. It was a dismissal, a final price tag on his time in their family. You'll sign a full non-disclosure agreement, of course, Thorne added smoothly. No one wants this to be messy. A heavy silence descended on the room. They all looked at him, expecting gratitude, or perhaps a desperate, last-ditch attempt at negotiation. They expected him to be broken, to see the $50,000 as a lifeline. They saw a drowning man, and they were offering him a leaky raft, believing he should thank them for it. Amelia finally looked at him, her expression a mixture of pity and impatience. "It's for the best, Ethan," she said softly, as if delivering a eulogy. "It's time to let go." Ethan took a slow breath. He looked from Richard's smug face to Thorne's coolly observant one. He looked at Eleanor's anxious fidgeting, and finally he looked at Amelia, the woman who had judged him, condemned him, and was now presiding over his banishment. The performance was over. It was his turn to speak. Ethan let the silence stretch, allowing their confidence to ripen to the point of arrogance. He could feel their impatience, their certainty that his next words would be those of capitulation. Richard shifted in his chair, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. Thorne tapped a pen on his legal pad, a gesture of bored finality. Finally, Ethan leaned forward, his posture changing from passive listener to active participant. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, measured calm that was more commanding than any shout. "Thank you, Richard," he began. "Thank you for laying out your perspective so clearly." He slowly turned his gaze to each person at the table, holding their eyes for a moment before moving to the next. "Before we discuss your generous offer," he said, the word generous carrying a subtle, sharp edge, "I would like to offer a little clarity of my own." He rested his hands on his simple leather portfolio. He didn't open it, not yet. The portfolio was his anchor, but the words would be his weapon. "For 5 years," he started, his voice even and steady, "I have been a guest in this family. I have sat at this table for holidays, birthdays, and countless Sunday dinners. And in all that time, I have been patiently listening." Richard's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Ethan, there's no need for dramatics." Ethan held up a hand, a simple gesture, but it carried an authority that silenced Richard mid-sentence. "Please," Ethan said, "you've had the floor. Allow me the same courtesy." He turned his attention to his father-in-law. "Richard, you've never missed an opportunity to remind me that my work was an artistic venture, not a real business. You've called my ambition a lack of pragmatism. Just last week, you offered to get me a charity job as a junior draftsman, a position you knew was profoundly insulting, presenting it as an act of paternal grace. You have consistently defined my worth by the numbers you could see, never bothering to look at the ones you couldn't." He then shifted his gaze to Eleanor. "Eleanor," he said, his tone softening slightly, but losing none of its precision. "Your primary concern upon hearing of my failure was not for my well-being, but for how to manage the narrative. You were worried about the shame, the appearance of it all. Your sympathy was a performance designed to protect the family's image, not to comfort a man you claimed to care for." Eleanor flushed, her hand fluttering to her pearls. "I never—" "And you, Amelia," he said, his voice dropping as he finally turned to his wife. The room seemed to shrink, the focus narrowing to the two of them at opposite ends of the long table. "You were my wife, my partner. When I told you my world had collapsed, you didn't offer a hand. You didn't say we. You said you needed to consider your options. Your first call was to your father, to strategize my disposal. Your second was to a divorce attorney. You moved into the guest room and began divvying up our life like an estate sale, deciding which memories belonged to you based on who paid for them." He paused, letting his words sink in. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tense, confused silence. This was not the broken, compliant man they had expected. "You handed me a list of real estate agents to sell the home we built together," he continued, his eyes locked on Amelia's. "You planned my new, smaller life for me while you arranged your escape. And when I wrote you a letter, pouring out what was left of my heart and asking if any part of us was worth fighting for, you didn't even open it." Amelia's face was pale. "Ethan, that's not fair." "Isn't it?" he asked, the question sharp and direct. "This isn't about money, Amelia. It never was. It was about respect. It was about partnership. It was about seeing me, the man you married, not the balance sheet you thought I represented." Richard, recovering his bluster, slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough. This is pointless melodrama. You're a broke, unemployed architect trying to save face. Sign the papers, take the money, and get on with your life." "You're right about one thing, Richard," Ethan said calmly. "It is time to get on with my life." He reached for his portfolio. The simple act seemed momentous in the charged silence. He unfastened the worn brass clasps, the clicks echoing in the room. He reached inside and pulled out not a sheaf of papers, but a single, bound document. It was thick, professional, and bore the logo of a firm far more powerful than any in that room. He slid it down the polished surface of the table. It glided silently, coming to a stop directly in front of Marcus Thorne. "Perhaps you should look at that before we continue this discussion," Ethan said. "It's the first page of my firm's acquisition agreement. The deal was finalized 3 months ago." Thorne, the consummate professional, looked at Ethan, then down at the document. His practiced neutrality wavered. He picked it up. His eyes scanned the top lines, then widened almost imperceptibly. He read further, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned back in his chair, his composure shattered, and let out a low, involuntary whistle. "What is it?" Richard demanded, his voice tight with impatience and a dawning sense of dread. Thorne didn't answer. He simply looked at Richard, his expression one of profound shock. He seemed to be reassessing everything in the room, especially the man at the other end of the table. Richard, his face turning a dangerous shade of red, snatched the document from his lawyer's hand. He held it, his eyes darting across the page. He read the names of the parties involved, Ethan's small firm and the global behemoth that had bought it. Then his eyes found the number, the acquisition price. A 9-figure sum that was beyond his comprehension, a number that dwarfed his own considerable wealth into insignificance. The sound that escaped Richard's lips was not a word, but a strangled gasp. The paper trembled in his hand. The ruddy color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at Ethan, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from water. The master of the universe had just seen a god. Eleanor, sensing the cataclysm, leaned over and peered at the page. Her hand flew to her mouth, her gasp a sharp, piercing sound in the stunned silence. But Ethan's focus was on Amelia. She hadn't seen the paper. She was watching her father's reaction, her face a canvas of utter confusion. "Dad? What is it? What's wrong?" Ethan spoke, his voice cutting through her confusion, calm and clear. "My firm wasn't failing, Amelia. It was being sold. For the past 2 years, while you and your family were pitying my little artistic venture, I was negotiating the largest deal of my life." He let that sink in before delivering the next blow. He reached back into his portfolio and pulled out a second document. This one he placed gently in the center of the table. It was a brochure, beautifully designed, with an elegant, minimalist logo. "The Phoenix Foundation," it read. "I'm not taking a job as a draftsman, Richard," Ethan said, his eyes on his father-in-law's slack-jawed face. "My partner and I have already established our next venture. It's a non-profit architectural foundation, fully endowed by the sale. Our first project is a state-of-the-art community and housing complex for the city's homeless. The groundbreaking is next month." The room was utterly still. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with seismic force. The judges had become the judged. The man they sought to banish was now revealed to be the king they had never seen. But he wasn't finished. There was one final, crucial piece of the structure to put in place, the piece that concerned Amelia directly. "There's the matter of the assets," Ethan said, his voice now holding a tone of businesslike finality. He looked directly at Marcus Thorne, who was now watching him with a newfound, almost fearful respect. "Amelia is concerned about the house and her personal assets. She needn't be." A flicker of desperate hope crossed Amelia's face. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps this was his way of showing her his power before forgiving her. "4 years ago," Ethan continued, "at Richard's insistence, Amelia and I signed a post-nuptial agreement. Do you recall, Amelia? You said it was to protect your family's assets, your inheritance, from the risk of my business, to keep what was yours separate from what was mine." Amelia nodded mutely, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "I always thought it was a sad way to view a marriage, but I agreed," Ethan said, "and I have honored that agreement to the letter. It's a legally binding document that meticulously defines our separate property. My firm and all proceeds from it are legally and indisputably mine." He paused, letting the brilliant, ruthless lawyer at the table mentally confirm the legal truth of his statement. Thorne gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He knew his clients were trapped. "Over the past 6 months," Ethan said, "as the acquisition became imminent, I began to restructure my finances, all in accordance with that agreement. The down payment your father so generously gifted us for the house, I paid it back to his investment account 6 weeks ago, with interest. The mortgage is now fully paid off, and the title is solely in my name. Our joint savings account, which mostly contained my earnings, was closed, and the funds moved to a new account, also solely in my name. Every shared asset was legally and carefully disentangled." He looked at Amelia, whose face had become a mask of horrified disbelief. "The house isn't being sold, Amelia. I'm quite fond of it. And as for your assets, you are, of course, entitled to everything that is legally yours, as per the agreement you so adamantly championed." He gestured to the boxes she had packed in the bedroom. "Your clothes, your jewelry, the painting your father bought you, that is what belongs to you. This house, and the life within it, belongs to me." The silence that followed was a living entity, a suffocating void where their arrogance and condescension had once been. It was the silence of complete and utter devastation. The chess match was over. Checkmate. The immediate aftermath was not the explosion of rage Ethan might have expected, but the implosion of a world. Richard was the first to break the spell, his mind, accustomed to finding angles and loopholes, scrambling for purchase on the sheer cliff face of his defeat. "This is fraud," he sputtered, his voice raspy. He pointed a trembling finger at Ethan. "You deceived us. You misrepresented your financial situation. We'll sue you. We'll sue you for everything." Marcus Thorne, who had been observing the carnage with the detached interest of a seasoned battlefield correspondent, finally spoke. He placed a calming hand on Richard's arm, his voice low and firm. "Richard, I would strongly advise you to be quiet right now." "But he lied," Richard insisted, his face contorted. "No, he didn't," Thorne corrected, his tone icy with professional assessment. "He allowed you to believe a narrative of your own creation. He never once made a false statement of material fact to a financial institution or in a legal document. He simply omitted telling you about his success. There is no law against that. In fact, everything he has described, particularly regarding the post-nuptial agreement you yourself commissioned, sounds perfectly, and I must say brilliantly, legal." The lawyer looked at Ethan with a grudging admiration. "He used your own weapon against you. You built the cage, Richard. He just let you walk into it." Richard sank back into his chair, deflated. The fight went out of him, replaced by the vacant stare of a man who had just watched his entire worldview burn to the ground. Eleanor was weeping softly, her sobs the only sound for a long moment. Then Amelia moved. She pushed her chair back and walked, almost drifted, around the long table until she stood beside Ethan. The cold marble statue was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading woman. Tears streamed down her face, real tears this time, hot and messy. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. She reached for his hand, but he moved it away, letting it rest on his portfolio. "Ethan, please, we can fix this. I didn't mean it. I was scared. I was listening to my father. It was a mistake." Her words tumbled out, a frantic cascade of excuses and pleas. "I love you. I've always loved you. This money, it doesn't have to change us. It can be a new start for us. For us." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, he felt not anger, not a cold resolve, but a vast, aching pity. He saw the terrified woman beneath the layers of pride and entitlement. He saw her, perhaps for the first time, as a product of her environment, a person so steeped in the values of wealth and status that she had no other compass to guide her. This was the moment of the moral mirror. He had to show her the reflection she refused to see in herself. "Amelia," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I have to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest, if not with me, then at least with yourself." She nodded frantically, willing to agree to anything. "If I had been telling the truth," he said, holding her gaze, "if my firm had truly failed, if I had lost everything, if that $50,000 offer was my only hope, would you be standing here right now, crying for us? Would you be telling me you loved me?" The question hung in the air between them, stark and unanswerable. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The frantic pleading in her eyes died, replaced by a flicker of horrifying self-awareness. They both knew the answer. If he were broken and penniless, she would be in her car, driving away, her lawyer's number on speed dial. Her tears were not for him, the man. They were for the life she had just lost, the future she had carelessly thrown away. The silence was her confession. He stood up, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "The agreement you wanted stands," he said, his voice now devoid of any lingering emotion. "It was simply a statement of fact. You will receive exactly what the postnup dictates. Your personal effects. The money your father invested in our down payment has been returned to him. There is nothing else. A truck will be at the house on Saturday morning to transport your belongings to your parents' home, or wherever else you'd like them sent. I will not be there." He looked around the room one last time, at the wreckage of the family who had so casually dismissed him. Richard, a collapsed titan. Eleanor, lost in her quiet grief for a social standing now in tatters. And Amelia, frozen, a dawning, permanent understanding etched onto her beautiful face. He turned and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. His footsteps were steady and even on the marble floor of the foyer. As he opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the rain, he felt the weight of the last 5 years lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a feeling of triumph or revenge. It was a feeling of release. The deconstruction was complete. It was time to start building again. The weeks that followed the confrontation were a study in diverging realities. Ethan's world expanded, filling with light, purpose, and the quiet hum of creation. Amelia's world, and that of her family, contracted, collapsing inward under the weight of their own choices. Ethan moved out of the house they had shared, not because he was ceding it, but because he couldn't stand the ghosts that lingered there. He took a sleek, modern apartment overlooking the park, a temporary space while the main house was being renovated, gutted of its old memories and redesigned to his own singular vision. He poured his energy into the Phoenix Foundation. The news of his firm's acquisition, followed by the announcement of his philanthropic new venture, had made waves in the architectural and business communities. He was no longer just a respected designer. He was a visionary, a force for change. People who had once been polite acquaintances now sought his counsel. Doors that had been closed were now wide open. He worked closely with David, their partnership stronger than ever. They spent long hours in their sunlit office, refining the designs for the community housing project, meeting with city officials, and assembling a team of the brightest young architects who were drawn to the foundation's mission. For Ethan, it was a profound homecoming. He was finally building what he had always wanted to build, without compromise, without the need to please a wealthy client or bow to a corporate brand. He was building for people, not for profit. Meanwhile, the world of Richard, Eleanor, and Amelia crumbled, not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, devastating fissures. The story of what happened in that dining room did not stay within its mahogany-paneled walls. Marcus Thorne, ever the pragmatist, saw no reason to protect a client who had so thoroughly self-destructed. The tale of Richard's hubris and Ethan's shocking reversal of fortune became a delicious piece of gossip, spreading like wildfire through the city's elite circles. Richard, a man whose identity was inextricably linked to his reputation as a shrewd, powerful player, became a laughingstock. His colleagues and rivals spoke of him in hushed, pitying tones. The story highlighted his greatest sin in their world. He had made a bad call. He had catastrophically misjudged a man, and in doing so, revealed his own blindness. His confidence, once his greatest asset, now looked like pathetic arrogance. The power he wielded had always been dependent on the perception of others, and that perception was now shattered. Amelia's fall was more personal and perhaps more painful. She moved back into her childhood bedroom, a 35-year-old woman living under her parents' roof, surrounded by the relics of a life that no longer existed. Her friends, the same ones who had listened sympathetically as she lamented her husband's failure, now kept their distance. Some were awkward, unsure what to say. Others, more cruelly, saw her as tainted by the scandal. She was no longer the wife of a promising, if modest, architect. She was the ex-wife of a titan who had been cast aside for her lack of faith. She tried to contact Ethan. The first few attempts were frantic, desperate voicemails left in the middle of the night. "Ethan, please, we have to talk. You can't just do this. I love you." As the days turned into weeks, the tone changed, becoming more pleading, more forlorn. He never answered. He never called back. His silence was a wall she could not breach, a final, definitive statement. One evening, about a month after the meeting, Amelia found her father sitting alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the unlit fireplace. The usual aura of indomitable confidence was gone, replaced by a weary, defeated slump in his shoulders. "Why didn't you ever respect him?" she asked, her voice quiet. It wasn't an accusation, but a genuine question. Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "He was quiet," he said, his voice rough. "He wasn't a shark. In my world, if you're not a shark, you're bait. I never thought he had it in him." "You were wrong," Amelia said softly. "Yes," Richard admitted, the word costing him dearly. "I was wrong." In that moment, Amelia saw her father not as the all-powerful patriarch, but as a man with a flawed, limited worldview. She saw that the values she had inherited, the obsession with status, the measurement of people by their net worth, were a fragile scaffold, easily knocked down. For the first time, she began to untangle her own identity from his. It was not redemption, not yet, but it was the beginning of a painful and necessary awakening. The silent enabler was finally finding her own voice, even if it was only to question the silence she had kept for so long. She had made her choices based on a set of rules she never thought to question. Now, living amidst the wreckage, she was forced to see that the game was rigged, and she had helped build it. The price of her loyalty to that game was the one person who had offered her a different way to live, a truth she had been unable or unwilling to see. 6 months passed. The seasons turned. The drizzling rain of that fateful day had given way to the crisp, clear light of autumn. Ethan stood in his new office. the renovated master suite of his house, looking out through a vast, single pane of glass at the city skyline. The room was his sanctuary now, a space of clean lines, natural wood, and abundant light. The ghosts had been exorcised. The house was no longer a monument to a failed marriage, but a testament to his own resilience and vision. Downstairs, the first floor had been transformed into the official headquarters of the Phoenix Foundation. Where the formal dining room once stood, there was now a collaborative workspace where young architects sketched and debated. The living room, once a stage for stiff family gatherings, was now a gallery showcasing the Foundation's projects. David came into the office holding 2 cups of coffee. "The city council approved the zoning variance," he said, a wide grin on his face. "Phase 1 of the downtown project is a go." Ethan took the cup, the warmth spreading through his hands. "That's good news, David. That's great news." They stood together for a moment, looking out at the city. It was a view Ethan had earned, not just with the money from the sale, but with his patience, his integrity, and his unwavering belief in his own worth, even when those closest to him had none. He felt a sense of profound peace, a quiet satisfaction that was far deeper and more lasting than the fleeting thrill of victory. He hadn't just won a battle, he had won back his life. "Have you heard from her?" David asked gently after a while. Ethan nodded. "I got a letter last week." On his desk, next to a stack of blueprints, lay a single envelope. He had read it several times. The letter was not the desperate plea of the voicemails. It was quiet, reflective, and painfully honest. Amelia wrote that she had moved out of her parents' house and into a small apartment of her own. She had taken a job, a real job she called it, at an art gallery, working as an assistant curator. It didn't pay much, but she said it was the first time she had ever earned something that was truly her own. She wrote that she finally understood what he had meant in the dining room. She apologized, not for losing the money, but for her lack of faith, for her blindness. She didn't ask for forgiveness or for a second chance. She simply wanted him to know that she was beginning to understand. She wished him well. He had read the letter, and he had felt not anger, not pity, but a sense of closure. He was happy for her. Her journey was her own, and it seemed she had finally taken the first difficult step. He picked up the letter, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. It was a part of his past, and he was ready to leave it there. His gaze returned to the window, to the sprawling city that he was now helping to shape in a real, tangible way. He thought about the nature of strength. Richard's strength had been loud, brittle, and built on the perception of others. It had shattered like glass. His own strength had been quiet, flexible, and built from within. It had endured. He had learned that true worth is not measured in dollars or social status, but in integrity, purpose, and the courage to remain true to yourself, especially when the world is telling you that you are worthless. Patience and principle, he now knew, were not weaknesses. They were the most formidable powers of all. He had faked losing his job and discovered his wife's heart was bankrupt. In the process, he had demolished a life built on false foundations and begun to build a new one, a better one, on solid ground. The past was a blueprint he had learned from, but the future was an open city waiting to be built. And he had his tools ready. What do you all think? Was Ethan's plan a justified act of revealing the truth, or was it a cold, calculated revenge? I'm always curious to hear where you land on the moral questions in these stories. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being here with me tonight. If you found this story satisfying, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more. I appreciate every single one of you. Until next time, be well.